Всем привет! ОБСЕ. Часто мы слышим и читаем много о деятельности ОБСЕ в Украине. И, к сожалению, это часто связано с ситуацией на Донбассе. Но на самом деле ОБСЕ — это известная структура, влиятельная международная структура. И еще до начала конфликта на Донбассе многие, кто интересовался, интересуется международными отношениями, знал эту структуру по защите прав человека в тех или иных сферах в Украине. Сегодня мы имеем уникальную возможность пообщаться с руководителем проектов ОБСЕ в Украине, господином послом Henrikом Villadsen. Mr. Ambassador, hi.
Hi, Andrey, how are you?
Thank you for your time. Thanks for your desire to communicate with me, to organize, to speak actually. About,
Pleasure.
Not very easy, I would say, things, because in the introducing of our interview, I said that a lot of people in Ukraine, they know your organization, they know OSCE, but I think that they're out of prejudice about the OSCE. Everybody think that you like a mediator in some things, and maybe you're like an organization who can resolve the conflict. But actually, a man who always interested in international relations, I know that you have a lot of tasks, a lot of projects, and you had in the past, you now have bigger tasks because of the situation in Donbass. What is the priorities of your activity in Ukraine for now, at least?
Thank you. Andrei, the situation is, of course, that Ukraine is very sensitive, what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. There's no doubt, there should be no doubt, that the situation in Ukraine, that is the biggest priority of the OSCE as an organization, to do what we can to help Ukraine. I think there's so much OSCE activity in Ukraine that it's quite easy to get confused, even if you live in Ukraine as we do. And I think I'll just say a few words about sort of the various forms that the OSCE has in Ukraine. Maybe that could be helpful. We have the special monitoring mission, which basically works on looking after and monitoring the conflict that's going on in the east.
This is a main task, but I'm as a lawyer and you as a former lawyer, we know that there is also a rule of law. There is a different legislation initiative, I don't know, the amendments. So you have a lot of another spheres. What are they?
You know, other than what the Special Monitoring Mission is doing, this mission that I'm leading is a separate one that is distinct from the Special Monitoring Mission. We've been here for more than 20 years, 22 years to be exact, this year. And what we do projects together with the Ukrainian government in these fields that the OSCE is interested in this comprehensive aspect of security, as we say, a comprehensive approach. And so we do projects, about 40 of them every year, together with the Ukrainian government, political, military projects, economical, environment projects, human rights and rule of law projects. So ours is sort of a very different work from the work that's done by the Special Monitoring Mission. We work with the Ukrainian ministries to try to improve the situation in those fields together with the Ukrainian government.
I know that also your organization is very seriously involved in the strengthening and the improvement situation concerning fighting the domestic so-called violence, and also in the monitoring of the elections, presidential elections and parliamentary elections, local elections. So what are the spheres also? Can you enumerate some of them, which also not only special monitoring, this is another question, and analyze it. But the other spheres, because you know that your organization and your cars, they are actually all over the Ukraine, capital Ukraine, the cars, the emblem, and every Ukrainian want to say, what are they doing here? It's not only Donbass.
Yeah, you know, the mission I lead is about, thank you for the question, the mission I lead is about 100 people, a bit more than that. And as I said, we do about 40 projects a year, and I can give you a few examples of that. We work on humanitarian mine action to help the Ukrainian government make plans about how to address this terrible situation about landmines and personnel mines, unexploded ordnances that are all over Ukraine, but of course now very, very big concentration of that in the east. We do a lot of work also in the east, but in other parts of Ukraine too, about addressing the environmental challenges that Ukraine is facing. We do quite a lot of work with the conflict-affected people. The people have been displaced. Many of them need humanitarian assistance. Many of them need psychosocial assistance, etc. We do quite a lot of dialogue work where we try to get into a dialogue together with the government, talking to communities throughout the Ukraine to address issues. We do, as you say, quite a lot of work with when it comes to elections, but that's more in relation to improving the electoral systems in Ukraine. And then, of course, another part of the OSCE, namely our office in Warsaw, they come in typically and monitor elections when you have elections in the country. So they come and go. We do quite a lot of work also in your field, in media, where we help with the media sort of to help regulate itself, so to speak.
Thanks for your activity. Actually, I'm like a citizen, like a specialist, like an expert. I want to thank you. Organization, you personally, Mr. Ambassador, for your activity in the east of Ukraine, because my mother lives in Donetsk and I have a house near the front line in Pervomaisk, this is the Pesky region, and I know how it is very complicated to operate there. You know, unfortunately, there are a lot of critics towards your organization, towards your activity. However, what are the main challenges which you tackle now concerning the improvement of the life of the ordinary Ukrainians in the east of Ukraine? I know your involvement is very, very serious and it's such kind of not difficult. I mean, not so easy to operate you in the east. What are the main challenges now you tackle concerning the current situation?
In the east?
Yes.
You know, we all have to work under the assumption that the conflict will end one day. That's the main objective. There is a lot of, when that's said, there is a lot of challenges that's going on there right now, and there's a lot of challenges to come when we come to the end of the conflict. I would say, in no particular order, the challenges we're dealing with now, it is also this side of the contact line. The mine situation is a very bad one. Humanitarian mine action is a big one. We have to address that as quickly as we can, so we can get the minefield cleared, also cleared up to such a standard that land can be given back to farmers, houses can be given back to people, so they can safely move back in after renovation in many cases. Land has to be given back to farmers so they can again farm their fields. And that requires a very big effort. And it has to be a systematic one, and that's what we are developing together with the Ukrainian authorities.
I know that you know that I was in Tajikistan. And I crossed actually the border between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan.
Yeah.
And concerning the mines, concerning the situation with mines, you know, because of the political problems which were between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, and the borders between two countries, they were mined for, I think, 15 years.
Yeah.
But when there was a political solution of the situation between two countries, the difficult process of remining or to finding the mines began. Yeah. So, as I understand, I'm not a professional, I'm not an expert. I mean, but how long it can take now, for example, to the remining, the pulling out the mines from the fields, you say. How really this work is complicated, because I know that a lot of international organizations also involved in this process. So as I understand, this is a long-term project despite the future of the conflict. I mean, how it will develop. Yeah,
unfortunately, you're right about that. I can say that the OSCE, of course, has quite a lot of, unfortunately, has a lot of experience with what we call humanitarian demining. Tajikistan is a good example. The OSCE has been involved in that, and actually the people that we've got here working on mining together, demining, together with the Ministry of Defense, Special Transport Service and so on. We've actually established a cooperation with Tajikistan so that Ukraine can learn from some of the experiences that Tajikistan has had. One of our very big supporters is another OSCE participating state, namely Croatia, which also had a very large mining problem. And we're also trying to draw in the Croatian expertise and experience. And I think that's some of the good things the OSCE can actually do, you know, to bring in experience from other countries and assist. Unfortunately, when we're speaking about the timing aspects of humanitarian demining, we are unfortunately speaking about, as you said, quite long perspectives, because you obviously want to be, first of all, it takes a long time to demine, but you also want to be absolutely sure that the mining standard is to a very high level before you give back land to civilian use. Maybe Ukraine is helped a little bit compared to a country like Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, because that's mountains, it's very difficult terrain, whereas where we've had a lot of the fighting going on in eastern Ukraine is fairly flat, and much of it agricultural land, which is a bit maybe less time consuming to demine. Yeah.
It's very good that you mentioned about the actually former Yugoslavia countries, and as I know you worked there. In what countries did you work, and what experience actually you get that which became useful in Ukraine? In what areas? You said mining. What else? I mean, maybe in peacekeeping process.
Yeah,
I can explain why I ask. A lot of people try to compare Yugoslavia and Donbass. I mean, the situation, but it's not always correct to compare. There is some very serious difference between situations, but humanitarian aspects, they are similar. In what sphere, for example?
I worked in 4 countries in the conflict in former Yugoslavia over a period of 20 years or so. And I'm always very careful, as you also say, I'm very careful with comparing what went on there to what went on here, or goes on here. But a conflict, of course, is always a conflict in the terms of the humanitarian consequences, the way that a conflict affects people, etc. So I think that there are, of course, things that one can compare. If we look away from just the conflict itself, I think we also have to ask the question, which I also hinted at a bit before. We also have to think about when the conflict ends, then what? There's almost all the areas that I mentioned that we work in before. There'll be political military issues, there'll certainly be environmental issues, economic issues, there'll be rule of law issues, there'll be human rights issues, there will have to be elections, etc., etc. So it's not just, even though I fully appreciate that's the most important thing right now, it's not just a question of ending the conflict, it's also a question of all the work that comes after.
Yeah, it's very good. It's very good that the organization, you personally, try to think about the future, because unfortunately we are used to think about what is happening now, but not to think about
you also did mention challenges in the East before, and we sort of got deeply involved in our discussion in mine action, but I'd also point to the environment in general being a huge issue.
It's a heavy industry region.
It was the heaviest industrialized region in Ukraine with heavy industries, and you have a lot of industries out there. You have coal mines, you have chemical plants, energy plants that have not been touched for many years, and the result of that is that you have a lot of pollutants that go into the whole water system.
Yes, we have a proverb among the Ukrainians from East Ukraine. We always say that the environment and problems, they did not see the front line. Yeah,
it's true. Because of our mandate and because the other OSCE mission, they are actively in the area that the government doesn't control. We're on this side of the confrontation line, if you like, but what we do with our work, we do a lot of monitoring with the water quality of the water that, of course, as you say, it does not know the confrontation line. So we can do a lot of water quality monitoring by doing work on this side of the confrontation line, which we do, and it's a very big issue that will need to be dealt with as soon as possible. And it's also always one that I mention as an area where the OSCE and others can do more, should do more. We must always keep that in mind.
What do you think about the generally your general impression about Donbass? I mean, the people, Ukrainians who live there. You have already been working in Ukraine for 3 years, if I'm not mistaken. You know the regional diversity, multicultural diversity. As I know, you were special representative of concerning national minorities. And what is your general impression, positive impression about the Ukrainians, about the people who live in different regions, especially in Donbass? I mean, the attitude, the humanism, like a man, an ordinary man. What can you say about the Ukrainians? Because we always think about the conflict. We always think about the political things, about geopolitical things, but also ordinary Ukrainians who live in different regions. And what your impression have about the Ukrainians actually as a people?
Well, I of course think that Ukrainians are lovely people, but you know.
It's a difficult question, but
you know, I don't go to our headquarters so often as I used to because of COVID and all that. I've basically been in Ukraine for the last year without going anywhere. But I certainly remember very often when I went to Vienna before, I was very often asked by my fellow diplomats in Vienna, so what do you think of the situation in Ukraine? And my answer was always that, what situation do you mean? There's about 15 or 20 situations going on at the same time. If you're speaking about the west of Ukraine, and then, as I've done many times, travel all the way across Ukraine, every town you stop in, things begin to look different. So it's a very diverse place, and of course that poses its own problems, because what may be a problem in one part of the country is not a part in another part of the country, and vice versa. So it's a I think it's a country, and of course history has proven that has tremendous possibilities, but it's not an easy country to manage either, because you can almost say that it's several countries in one.
Yeah, I think the potential of Ukraine, I mean the diversity of regional is one of the biggest achievements of the Ukrainian side and Ukrainian state. And unfortunately, when you say about the regions, I always think about the internally displaced persons.
Yeah.
Because the conflict caused, I would say, enormous migration process inside Ukraine and abroad. So actually, the internally displaced persons, the refugees, they came to all regions of Ukraine.
Yeah.
I know that the organization also tried to analyze the statistics, the migration process. This is one of your priorities, to work with the displaced persons. Do you have some kind of projects concerning the improvement of this category of people from Donbass?
Yeah, we do. Of course, the OSCE is not a specialized agency. You have others like the UNHCR, of course, that have a direct mandate, and certain parts of the European Union deeply involved in that. But we do try to concentrate a lot of our work on the conflict-affected population. For example, psychosocial rehabilitation of conflict-affected people is something we worked a lot with. Just a couple of weeks ago, we opened together with the Ministry of Veterans Affairs, we opened this rehabilitation center in Lisova Polyana, just here outside of Kiev, where we try to provide help to people that have been affected by the conflict. And we do a lot of work on that, also much closer to the contact line.
And I think that the operating in Donbass, in the front line, is always a very dangerous task, but as I understand you, unfortunately, your organization adopted to work in such kind of circumstances. But the conflict in Donbass, I always name it semi-frozen. You know, it's not like in Transnistria, in South Ossetia. It's semi-frozen. That's why I think it's not so difficult to. I mean, it's not so easy to work in such kind of circumstances, if you comparison with the other countries, yes, for example, or other conflicts. So if you speak about the psychological improvement of the internally displaced persons, what do you think, what are the biggest, I don't know, problems have the Ukrainians from Donbass, I mean, who was forced to come out? What their psychological perception of the situation? Do they have some kind of peculiarities in comparison with the refugees or internally displaced persons in former Yugoslavia, or all the equal concerning the harm they have, psychological trauma maybe, they have? What are maybe the peculiarities you can emphasize in Ukraine, in Donbass, or unfortunately they're all equal? I mean, the people who touched by the conflict.
Yeah.
what can you emphasize about this thing? Because internally displaced people, you know, that they always think that Ukrainian state is quite not enough. Have attention to them, you know.
Yeah.
And this psychological trauma, it's took many years to overcome such kind of
Yeah.
condition.
Yeah.
You know, in my relatives, you know,
Yeah.
they begin to criticize everybody.
Yeah.
Your fault, and my fault, everybody's fault. But such kind of circumstances.
Yeah.
How to manage and to tackle with such kind of difficult group of people? I mean, in the psychological thing. What recommendations? I don't know. You can say difficult. But what is your impression about such kind of thing?
You know, it's of course it's a very human question.
Humanism. Yeah.
And I think that what you can say about people that are refugees, if they have crossed a border, if they're in, you know, internally displaced, if they have stayed within their own country but still had to move, you know, one of the common things you can say that, okay, they've not lost their life as a part of the conflict, but they've lost everything else.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, they've lost their property, they've lost their home, they may have very well have lost family members, they may have lost parents, they may have lost children, friends, the right to many things, schooling,
education.
You know, education, and I think in that situation, it's very difficult not to become bitter with regards to what has happened, because many times most of the people are civilians and it was not their fault, you know. So therefore it's easy to become bitter. And it's also very easy for others to say, well, you know, you should stay positive. I don't have a, you know, a magic wand to make people positive. It's a question of doing what we can to get back to some sort of normalcy, right? And here I'm not speaking about the OSCE or about other organizations. Here I'm speaking about other humans at large. So, yeah, what can we do? I mean, we have to...
but you do a lot. You're involved in such kind of sustainable dialogue.
Yeah, we did.
Sustainable peace dialogue. What does it mean in practice?
Yeah, you know, we've done a lot of work with dialogue, and I'm very often asked the question, you know, so what do you mean? And let me try to explain. You know, the OSCE is basically an organization that started with dialogue. It started as these conferences back in the 1970s, where what was discussed was the reductions of arms arsenals, nuclear arms, conventional arms, etc., etc. So the OSCE is a dialogue. It has got dialogue in the DNA, right? And it's also got dialogue between enemies in the DNA, you know. So that sort of dialogue approach is also there. And when the first displacements out of eastern Ukraine began, or out of Donbass began, we from the OSCE side started these dialogue projects where we take the displaced and the conflict-affected population and engage them in a discussion. If you're displaced, in a discussion within the communities where you have arrived. We also involved government agency representatives coming out from Kiev, try to explain what would be done, etc., etc. And those dialogue exercises, so to speak, they had quite some success. The way we do it is that we don't just meet to talk, but we have professionally educated mediators that comes out and help to organize the discussion and the dialogues. And it was quite successful, and we actually have found that in other parts of Ukraine it has also been useful with the explaining the decentralization process to local communities, etc. And now, just since I think a year and a half ago now, we work with the civil servants of Ukraine, with the Institute for Civil Service, where we also train their staff in dialogue mechanics, so to speak.
Yeah,
so
mechanics, procedure. It's a new experience even for Ukrainians, because we didn't have such kind of...
You know, I think, to be honest, when it was first started, I think many parts of Ukraine were sort of quite suspicious about what was it actually about.
What is a final aim?
Yeah, you know, and we have seen over the time, well, I've been here the last couple of years, there has actually been a growing interest from Ukrainian institutions and also civil society to go into to further of these dialogue processes. So I think it's been a success in the sense that we've able to convince people, civil society, and at the same time also authorities that dialogue is a good thing.
Yes, and I think the people began in Ukraine. I mean, they understand the necessity of such kind of mechanics, as you say, to strengthening, to improving the situation, despite the political things.
I think so.
Yes, and thank you for your experience, for sharing your experience, for me, for my compatriots concerning the understanding, the realizing of such kind of mechanism. And when we speak about the general situation, I cannot not to ask you about the COVID, of the pandemic. I know that when I took the interview, when I interviewed with your colleague from the UN,
yes.
it was a huge part of our interview concerning the analyzing situation and how the pandemic caused or influence on your work in the east of Ukraine, in the Donbass. What can you see? How we can tackle such kind of situation? How we can overcome this not so easy situation? We understand. I mean, this is a long-term problem. We cannot wait when pandemic will go out and then start. You are acting despite, and you are working despite the pandemic. What are the challenges now?
I wish that we didn't have to have this part of the conversation. I wish we could just imagine that it was not out there and we didn't have to deal with it. But unfortunately, we do. And it's been a year now, and we very quickly realized that, of course, we would have to do things differently. And like everybody else, we sort of got quickly used to working more online and so on and so on. And I think that we, in spite of the pandemic, we managed to get a lot of things done, but obviously there's also a lot of changed dynamics with the work that we do because of the pandemic. I can mention an example like domestic violence. Like everywhere in the world, the issue of domestic violence has risen dramatically during the pandemic period, simply because people have to be locked up in sometimes, small rooms and so on, so on. So tensions also in the homes are rising, and according to many of the available information that we have, both from civil society and government institutions, we are probably speaking about a rise that's somewhere between 20 and 30%. And I'm just using that as an example, but we managed to change some resources and step up the work that we are doing with the National Police of Ukraine to try to help counter that as a problem. So not only have we had to do things differently, but of course also several priorities have changed because of the pandemic. Another example that could be somewhat related is, for example, sexual exploitation of children on the internet. That cybercrime is something that has risen. You have recruitment for trafficking in human beings via the internet has also risen. So those sort of cybercrime related elements is something that we also are trying to work more with during the pandemic.
So you want to say that the pandemic on the one hand caused terrible disaster for humanity. On the other hand, it showed the harmful spheres which were not defended in the past. I mean, we tackle new challenges, new and unprecedented challenges concerning the cybersecurity, concerning the domestic rule, concerning the maybe divorce process. Because I'm a lawyer, I understand that the pandemic changed social relations, I would say, in the society. And so we will have new challenges, not only Ukraine, but all over the world. And you said about the cyber attacks, about the cyber security, and as I understood, you helped our country a lot to tackle such kind of problems. Yes.
Yeah, it's certainly something that we work on, and those three examples that I mentioned. Domestic violence, trafficking in human beings, overall cyber security. It's certainly issues that have risen during the pandemic, and then we will have to face. I read a book recently about the the Spanish flu in the 1918, 1919, and how the world was never the same again. And you know, let's hope that we get through the pandemic as quickly as humanly possible. But there's no doubt that the world is not just going to be going back to what it was like before.
And my last question concerned the rule of law, because we are lawyers, we are professionals in the legislative sphere, and you know that rule of law is a very important task for, I would say, even examine for our country, because despite the critics, we have quite developed civil society, and thanks the organization for helping us to building law system actually in Ukraine. And what are the main priorities in rule of law in the building or in helping support of rule of law in Ukraine? I know that you're involved in constitutional justice. What are the main spheres and what are the main achievements in these spheres, you can say?
Yeah, big question here. As one of the last ones, was a big one. Of course, rule of law is very much a part of and human rights, very much a part of what the OSCE believes in. When we are speaking about a comprehensive approach to security, we believe that if you do not have a functioning rule of law, you cannot have a safe safe country, basically. We have, of course, there's a lot of actors involved in building rule of law in Ukraine, but let me say, when it comes to Ukraine's fulfillment of its international ambitions, etc., rule of law is right up there as one of the absolute top priorities. And what we have been doing together with other international organizations is that we of course focus on some parts of rule of law, and then others focus on others, because it's a big and a broad field. So we've been doing a lot of work with the establishment of the Supreme Court of Ukraine in its current form. We've been working a lot on the Constitutional Court, with the Constitutional Court. We've been working a lot on anti-corruption issues. I think what's important to say, it is that none of these issues, all of them, or institutions, none of them are quick fixes. I think what has been achieved in Ukraine, it is that the structures have been set up, but you can't expect that such heavy fundamental mechanisms that will begin to work perfectly from day one. I think it takes time.
Patience.
And we just have to keep working on it. There's no alternative. And when I say we, I mean Ukraine together with us and other partners. It's a big field. I'm very proud of a number of the things we've done also on the more practical level. For example, we have worked quite a lot together with civil society on the monitoring of children's rights in courts recently, big issue, which is work that we are continuing together with the Ombudsperson of Ukraine, sort of speaking about more practical things we've done. But I think when it comes to the bigger issues in rule of law, it's a question of just have to keep working on it and realize that it's not going to necessarily be perfect just around the corner.
And at the end of our interview, I want to ask you one question. Usually I ask everybody, my interviewers, about the forecast, general forecast for this year. I want to say that I think the world will be changed, and we actually should realize that there will be new circumstances, new conditions in the world. What are the challenges for your organization in Ukraine for this year, you think? Actually, I think said and enumerated all your priorities, and thank you for your activity. But what you're waiting in this year? I mean, what are the main challenges and main priorities concerning what is happening in the east of Ukraine, concerning the general pandemic situation? What are the main things we should, Ukrainians and the people should understand now? What are the main challenges, I would say, how to tackle all these problems, you know? Because when there was a conflict in Donbass, everybody in Ukraine thought about the stop of war. When the pandemic came, everybody speak about the stopping of pandemic. When the forest was in Chernobyl, forest fires, everybody thought about the fire in forest in Chernobyl and forget about pandemic. You know, there are a lot of things, and they changed even my mind. What we should wait in this year? I mean,
well, you know, it's a pretty big. It's a pretty big selection that one can choose from. You know, I mean, there were problems enough in Ukraine before the pandemic started. That's for sure. The pandemic has made things more difficult for everyone all over the world. I think it's a question of staying focused. If you look at the pandemic, after all, the numbers are not going down, but after all, there's now vaccines are coming in, etc. Now we are probably getting better to deal with it. So let's stay focused. Let's try to get out of that as best as we can, and let's not drop the ball on the other issues. First and foremost, the conflict in the East has to be stopped. People are being killed every day. That has to stop. And we have to stay focused on that as well, and then we have to do all we can to move forward from there. Here I'm thinking about some of the issues that we spoke about earlier in the interview, like humanitarian mine action, like the environmental situation in Donbass, and helping the people that are affected by the conflict, first and foremost.
Good words and good recommendations, I would say. Thank you, Mr. Mester, for your time, for your interview, and for your very sincere answers to not very easy questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.